It happened at one of the most prestigious academic conferences in the country, a gathering where some of the brightest young minds in America came to challenge ideas, defend philosophies, and spark real debate. But no one was prepared for what would unfold that day. When a renowned atheist professor used his platform to humiliate people of faith, he didn't expect a student, Barron Trump, to rise from the audience and challenge him in a way that would leave the entire room stunned. What happened next changed the way many viewed the relationship between faith and intellect forever. If you believe that courage and clarity still matter, give this video a like and subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. The conference hall at the Eastbrook Institute buzzed with energy. This wasn't your average university gathering. It was invitation only, an elite symposium for the country's most promising students and top-tier faculty. The theme this year? Rational Thinking in the Modern Age. Among the crowd of prodigies and professors sat Barron Trump, the youngest participant on record. At just 18, he had earned a spot through academic merit, though not everyone believed that. Whispers followed him. He's only here because of his last name, some muttered. But one professor in particular didn't whisper. He spoke loudly and with intent. Professor Nathaniel Carter, a tenured psychologist known for his sharp tongue and sharp opinions, was a keynote speaker. To his fans, he was a brilliant mind dismantling old ideas. To critics, he was a provocateur who had bias behind academic jargon. To Carter, faith, especially Christianity, was not just outdated. It was an enemy of progress. The lights dimmed. Carter stepped to the podium and looked out over the audience with practiced confidence. "Let's talk about intelligence," he began, "and why it's inversely related to religious belief." A few chuckles echoed around the hall. Studies show that as education levels rise, belief in God declines. In simpler terms, the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in fairy tales. Laughter grew louder. Some students nodded. Others looked around awkwardly. Barron sat quietly, unmoved. Behind Carter, a graph appeared on the screen. Bright red lines diving downward to visually represent the so-called collapse of faith as intelligence increased. But of course, Carter added with a smirk, there are exceptions. Some people, despite their education, cling to family traditions. Old habits die hard. He glanced deliberately at Barron. This time, the laughter was louder. At the back of the room, Professor Henry Wallace, a quiet and thoughtful academic, frowned. He'd seen Carter push boundaries before, but this felt different. This felt targeted. Barron still didn't move. His posture was upright, his expression calm. Carter's voice became more animated as he paced the stage. "You know what I find truly remarkable?" he said. "Some of the most intelligent people in this room, future leaders, scientists, engineers, still believe that there's a man in the sky watching their every move." He raised his eyebrows in mock disbelief. "And they call that faith," he continued. "I call it intellectual laziness, a crutch for those unwilling to accept that life is random, chaotic, and ultimately godless." Another ripple of laughter, but it was thinner this time. Barron's jaw tightened, slightly. Still, he didn't respond. Carter zeroed in. "Perhaps one of our more politically connected students would like to explain how belief in an invisible sky, Father, doesn't disqualify someone from being taken seriously in academic discourse." Now the room went quiet. Every eye turned toward Barron. He stood up. No theatrics. No anger. Just calm, controlled movement. "Actually, Professor, I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A few students whispered. Some smiled, expecting Carter to easily outmaneuver the young man. But Barron didn't seem nervous. In fact, he looked entirely prepared. If you're with us so far, help us out. Like this video and subscribe to join a growing community that believes in both faith and reason. Let's hit that 1,000 subscriber goal together. "Actually, Professor, I'd be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A few scattered laughs broke the tension in the room, but they faded quickly as Barron stepped forward. He didn't flinch. He didn't rush. His voice was clear but controlled. "In fact, I find it interesting that someone who claims to value logic so highly would make the assumption that belief in God equates to a lack of intelligence. That's not science. That's bias." The laughter stopped. Even Carter's smirk wavered slightly. And if you truly do value intellectual honesty, Barron continued, you'd recognize that many of the world's greatest scientific minds, Sir Isaac Newton, Max Planck, Francis Collins, found no contradiction between reason and belief. He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Einstein once said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The smirks faded. Eyes turned from Carter to Barron with a mix of surprise and curiosity. Barron walked a few steps toward the projection screen. Now, let's talk about the graph you used. You're showing a correlation between education and decreased religious belief. But correlation doesn't imply causation. That's a basic statistical principle, one I assume your students are expected to understand. Some of those same students now look down at their notepads, no longer amused. Correlation, Barron said, can be influenced by many factors, cultural pressures, institutional biases, even peer conformity. So unless you're willing to prove direct causation, your argument is based on assumption, not evidence. A quiet murmur passed through the hall. Professor Wallace glanced at Carter, then back at Barron, intrigued. And finally, Barron said, turning back to face the audience, let's talk about faith itself. You claim that faith is incompatible with intelligence, but I would argue the opposite. Faith is often what compels us to pursue the deepest questions about life, morality, and purpose. His voice remained steady, but it grew in conviction. It takes faith to believe in things we can't empirically measure, like human rights, love, justice, or even the value of truth. These are not mathematically provable, yet they shape everything we do. So the question isn't whether faith and intelligence can coexist. The question is whether a man so confident in his own intellect can accept that he doesn't have all the answers. There was no applause, no shouting, just a heavy silence, the kind that comes when an argument hits deeper than expected. Carter stood still. His arms, once confidently crossed, now hung loosely by his sides. He opened his mouth to reply, but found no words waiting. His carefully built rhythm had been interrupted, and the tone in the room had shifted. He cleared his throat. Well, let's move on, he said, voice lower than before. But everyone knew they weren't moving on. Not really. Students who once looked at Carter now looked at Barron with something else. Respect. Barron sat down quietly, his expression neutral. He wasn't performing. He wasn't grandstanding. He had simply answered the challenge, and answered it well. Carter forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Spare us the Sunday school sermon. He snapped suddenly, his voice regaining some sharpness. I've spent 3 decades studying cognitive development. Are you suggesting you know more than I do? I'm suggesting, Barron replied calmly, that your bias is showing. You claim to follow evidence, yet you dismiss the long history of brilliant thinkers who saw no contradiction between science and belief. Carter scoffed. Newton, Planck, Collins. That's ancient history. Are you going to tell us next that God created the universe with a magic wand? His laugh was hollow. No one laughed with him. Barron stood again, slowly. You know what's fascinating, Professor? He said. You mock faith while display your own kind of faith, a blind faith in your own intellectual superiority. You've built a worldview where anyone who disagrees with you must be ignorant. A silence fell again. At the back of the room, Professor Wallace leaned forward slightly, watching Carter's jaw tighten. You preach rationality, Barron said, but what you really practice is a form of dogma. And ironically, that's exactly what you claim to oppose. A few students exchanged glances. Some nodded just slightly. Fine, Mr. Trump, Carter said through clenched teeth. You want a debate? Then come down here. Let's hear you explain how your medieval beliefs survive modern scientific scrutiny. He gestured toward the podium. The room buzzed. This wasn't just a reply anymore. It was becoming something else, something deeper, more meaningful. Barron didn't hesitate. He walked down the aisle toward the stage with quiet confidence, past Carter, and turned to face the audience. Once again, every eye was on him. Loving how this is unfolding? Support us by hitting subscribe and help us hit that 1,000 subscriber goal. Let's spread logic, courage, and real discourse together. Since you brought up quantum physics, let's start there, Barron began, standing at the podium with a calm presence. You claim that faith is incompatible with science, yet quantum mechanics itself challenges many of the assumptions we once considered unshakable. Particles behaving differently when observed, objects existing in multiple states at once, an underlying unpredictability at the heart of everything. Doesn't that suggest the universe might be more mysterious than pure materialism can explain? Carter rolled his eyes. Please don't misuse quantum mechanics to justify superstition. I'm not misusing it, Barron replied, his tone polite but firm. I'm pointing out that even our most advanced science reveals limits to what we can definitively explain, and that humility, intellectual humility, is something you seem unwilling to consider. He paused briefly before continuing. You spoke about cognitive development. You argue that belief in God is a sign of lower intelligence. But you ignore research showing that people of faith often report higher life satisfaction, stronger community ties, and greater psychological resilience. That doesn't fit your narrative, does it? Carter narrowed his eyes. Correlation doesn't equal causation, he snapped. Exactly my point, Barron said. And yet earlier, you presented a graph implying causation between intelligence and a lack of faith. Why is it valid for you, but invalid for me? The audience stirred. A few students exchanged quiet remarks. Professor Wallace leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Carter with a measured expression. But let's get to the heart of your argument. Barron continued. You're not just mocking religion. You're mocking those who believe. Because in your mind, belief is a weakness. Something that should be ridiculed, not respected. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. But here's the real question. What's more intellectually honest? Admitting there are things science hasn't yet explained, or pretending that anything beyond your current understanding must be false? The hall was completely silent. When you mock faith, Professor, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking billions of people across cultures and centuries who have found meaning and purpose in their relationship with something greater than themselves. Many of those people, scientists included, built the very foundations of modern knowledge. Barron let that hang in the air before continuing. So tell me, Professor, what's more indicative of intellectual immaturity? Believing in something greater than yourself, or believing that mockery is a substitute for thoughtful discourse? Carter's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He gripped the edge of the podium, visibly rattled. You're twisting this, he said, voice sharp and defensive. You're implying that just because science doesn't know something yet, we should insert God into the gaps. Barron didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his tone. I'm not inserting anything, Professor. I'm acknowledging mystery. You, on the other hand, seem to believe that nothing exists beyond what you can measure or test. That's not science. That's a belief system of its own. Some heads in the room nodded. Even students who had smiled at Carter's earlier jokes now sat fully focused on Barron. Let's talk about origins, Barron said. You believe that consciousness emerged from unconscious matter. That life came from non-life. That order came from chaos, all without guidance. And yet, you accuse others of having blind faith? You let that sink in. Which takes more faith, Professor? Believing in a divine creator? Or believing that nothing created everything? Carter said nothing. You stand here and ridicule people of faith. But isn't it possible that your own worldview depends on assumptions you can't prove? Barron took a breath, his tone steady. You suggest that believers are intellectually weak, yet you're using your authority in this stage as a crutch to silence dissent. So tell me, who's really insecure? Carter's face flushed. His grip on the podium tightened again, but he still didn't answer. Barron stepped back slightly. You claim to champion free thinking, yet you ridicule anyone who thinks differently. You promote reason, yet you shut down opposing perspectives before they're even heard. He turned and looked across the room. You say belief in God is irrational. But I ask you, what's irrational about seeking meaning? What's irrational about believing that love, justice, and purpose might point to something beyond particles and chance? He paused, scanning the room. If belief in God is such a threat to your worldview, Professor, then maybe the problem isn't the belief itself, but the fact that you can't disprove it. The room remained silent. Carter looked down, his confidence shaken. A few students looked to one another, nodding subtly. Professor Wallace slowly sat forward, as if recognizing a turning point in the entire event. Hey, if Barron's strength is inspiring you, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button and help us grow this community of thoughtful thinkers. We're getting closer to our 1,000 subscriber goal every day. Barron remained poised at the front of the room, the silence around him thick with anticipation. Carter, still gripping the podium, looked as though he were searching for a comeback, but none came. You say science has explained everything that religion once claimed was divine, Barron continued. But that's simply not true. Science can describe processes, but it still can't answer the most fundamental questions. Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is consciousness? He took a measured step toward the professor. And yet, despite these unanswered questions, you speak with absolute certainty. That certainty isn't the product of evidence. It's dogma. Carter clenched his jaw. I deal in data, not superstition. Barron nodded. Then perhaps you can explain why the constants of the universe are so precisely fine-tuned for life to exist. Why is gravity not slightly stronger or weaker? Why does the speed of light have the exact value it does? A fraction off, and we wouldn't be here. Carter didn't respond. Barron turned slightly, addressing the entire room again. Isn't it interesting that those who reject faith so strongly often display their own kind of religious fervor? A faith, not in God, but in themselves, in the idea that human reason alone can unlock every truth, solve every mystery, and rule out every possibility. He looked back to Carter. That's not rationalism. That's arrogance. Some students shifted in their seats. A few leaned forward, visibly more engaged than before. You say that belief in God is a mental weakness. That people believe because they're afraid or uneducated. But that's not what I see. I see faith that inspires courage, faith that fuels service, faith that shapes civilizations, hospitals, human rights, abolition, forgiveness, redemption. His voice remained calm, but carried weight now. And still, you dismiss it. You insult it. You degrade it. Not because it's false, but because it threatens the illusion that you have it all figured out. Barron held his gaze. So I ask you again, Professor, if belief in God is so intellectually bankrupt, why does it bother you so much? Why are you so threatened by it? Carter didn't answer. His face was tense. His voice, for once, was silent. Barron stepped away from the podium and let the moment settle. You claim that proving God's existence is impossible. Fine. But you also claim, without hesitation, that God does not exist. And that's the contradiction. Because any honest scientist knows that proving a universal negative is impossible. So your certainty isn't scientific. It's belief masquerading as fact. A murmur ran through the room. And there's more, Barron continued. You accuse believers of blind devotion. But what you practice is the same. You mock religious conviction, but your own ideology, your own self-assurance, is just as rigid, just as unchallenged, just as unexamined. He paused. You've simply replaced God with your own intellect. And in doing so, you've made yourself untouchable, unquestionable. And that is not science. That is idolatry of the mind. The room remained frozen. The smugness that had filled the hall earlier was gone. Students who once laughed at Carter's jabs now sat silently, watching. Barron looked out over the crowd. I'm not asking anyone here to believe what I believe. I'm asking you to think, truly think, about what you've been told, about what you've accepted without question, about what ideas you've dismissed not because they were weak, but because you never gave them a chance. Professor Wallace's eyes hadn't left Barron. Slowly, he nodded. Carter, meanwhile, was stone still. You see, Professor, Barron said softly, the real danger isn't in believing in something greater than ourselves. The real danger is when we become so convinced of our own superiority that we stop listening, stop questioning, and start ridiculing. He took one final breath. You asked me if faith survives scrutiny. I ask you, can your certainty survive the same? Barron returned to his seat. There was no applause, no need for it. The silence said everything. The silence in the hall was heavier than any applause could have been. Professor Carter stood frozen, his face pale, his hand still gripping the podium, his commanding presence so powerful at the beginning, had been reduced to something quieter, smaller, human. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. Professor Wallace sat back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the moment unfold with something like relief and maybe a bit of vindication. He had warned Carter for years that mockery wasn't teaching. That Rayall thought required humility. Now Carter's silence confirmed what words could not. For the next 30 minutes, Carter attempted to continue his lecture, stumbling through slides, his voice wavering. The title behind him, Rational Thinking in the Modern Age, now felt painfully ironic. Each sentence he uttered seemed to echo with the memory of Barron's questions, his reasoning, and his unshakable calm. Students looked at their notebooks, but few were taking notes. They weren't thinking about the lecture anymore. They were thinking about what they had just witnessed. When class was dismissed, there was no rush for the doors. Instead, the room buzzed with quiet conversations. Groups formed in corners. Some students glanced toward Barron, their eyes different now, curious, respectful, even inspired. Others looked at Carter with something he had never seen before, doubt. Barron stood and quietly gathered his things. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply stood his ground with logic, clarity, and confidence, not just in his intellect, but in something deeper. As he reached the exit, a voice called out. That was incredible. He turned. Several students stood by the door, watching him. One gave a small nod. Others followed with quiet words of thanks, admiration. One girl said softly, "You made me think about things I've never questioned before." Barron simply smiled and replied, "I'm glad." He didn't linger. At the back of the room, Professor Wallace stood and slowly approached Carter, who remained behind the podium, staring down at his notes like they belonged to someone else. "Nathaniel," Wallace said quietly. Carter didn't respond at first. Then he gave a slow, shallow nod. "Maybe," Wallace said after a pause, "this is an opportunity." Carter finally looked up. His expression was different now. There was no anger, no arrogance, just the look of someone who had seen himself more clearly than he expected to. Later that afternoon, long after the room had emptied, Carter was seen sitting alone in the lecture hall, still staring at his notes. Notes that once felt like truth, now scattered like relics of a perspective too small to hold up under pressure. Then, quietly, Barron appeared again at the doorway. "Excuse me, Professor." Carter looked up. His voice, when it came, was softer than it had been all day. "You know," he said, "in all my years of teaching, no one has ever challenged me like that. Not with emotion, not with anger, but with clarity. You didn't just argue. You made me question myself." Barron gave a small nod. Sometimes the strongest argument for faith come from those who try the hardest to destroy it. Carter didn't respond right away. He looked down again, then murmured, "Maybe the truly closed minds aren't the ones who believe in God, but the ones who mock those who do." That moment would be remembered for years, not just as a debate between student and professor, but as a turning point, a reminder that faith and intellect are not enemies, and that true understanding requires more than logic. It requires humility. Barron Trump didn't walk away a hero. He didn't need to. He walked away as a young man who proved that strength comes not from shouting down opposition, but from standing tall in the face of it. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that faith, when paired with reason, becomes something unstoppable. If this story made you think, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. And if you're ready for another powerful story like this one, click the video on your screen now, because truth deserves to be heard, and we're just getting started.